Welcome to Radio Arctic here at the Arctic Frontiers in Tromsø. We are now going to have a session with three experts on the theme Beyond Borders, Navigating the High Seas and Arctic Governance. My name is Gudrun, and I'm sitting here with my colleague
Anna.
And welcome.
A short introduction to the session here today. But in the emerging area of the High Seas Treaty, a significant transformation is underway and international efforts to conserve and sustainably use marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Drawing parallels with the historical link between military power and the age of oil, the high seas have become a focal point for strategic global competition. As many nations recognize the high seas as a valuable commodity, there's also concerns about fair access and sustainable management surface. The High Seas Treaty is set to reshape global governance, initiating a competitive race for valuable mineral resources.
And it's on this note that we have invited Christian Prip, Gunnar Sander, and Vito de Lucia from the panel session yesterday. Can the High Seas Treaty cure Arctic governance? Help our Arctic frontiers. And maybe briefly, could you then introduce your voice and what involvement and affiliation you are connected to regarding the High Seas Treaty?
Should I start?
Yes.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. So my name is Vito de Lucia. I'm professor of international law and director of the Norwegian Center for the Law of the Sea. In relation to this treaty, I've been following the negotiations since 2016-17 as an observer at the United Nations, and partly also together with Christian Prip. We've been together in some projects, and from very early on, we try to look at what are the implications of this treaty for Arctic governance.
Yeah, I'm Christian Prip. I work for the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo as a senior researcher. And as Vito said, we have been working on the process leading to this treaty for many years. Actually, I started following the treaty preparation before that, because it started more than 20 years ago. Actually, at that time, I was not a researcher. I was working for the Ministry of Environment in Denmark, where I was involved in international negotiations on biodiversity related issues.
Yeah, my name is Gunnar Sander, and I'm a senior scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. And like Christian, I became aware of this more than 20 years ago, and I've tried to follow the process, not as direct as the two others here, because I've never attended any other sessions, but I've tried to follow the developments. And my peculiar interest has been both ecosystem-based management, which may be a part of the first part, area-based management tools, but especially environmental impact assessments and the requirements for those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
And on this note, can you maybe provide then our listeners with an explanation of the term high seas? And what is the High Seas Treaty, or the BBNJ Treaty, and what it encompasses?
So the High Seas Treaty, which is a very utilized formulation to refer to this treaty, really refers to one or two maritime zones which are under the jurisdiction of this treaty. So it only covers partially what this treaty is about, because the treaty is about the conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And according to the Law of the Sea Convention, the area beyond national jurisdiction are really two different maritime zones. One is the high seas, which is the water column, which is beyond the limits of national jurisdictions. It's a residual category, which, however, is large, is over 50% of the surface of the globe. But then there is also the ocean floor and deep sea bed, also beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, which is usually referred to as the area, and was key regulatory framework is established in the Law of the Sea Convention. It relates primarily to the extraction of minerals, so deep sea bed mining would fall under, and there is specific institutions that look after that, but this is also within the scope of the convention. So High Seas Treaty is very easy to understand. but it only covers one element of what the treaty is about.
But maybe we use a very technical expression. I don't know how the listeners are familiar with that. We talk about jurisdiction, and I'm not sure if all the listeners will understand that. Can we explain that simply, Vito? For instance, saying that if a state has national jurisdiction, that state can decide. And when there is an area beyond national jurisdiction, we can say that no state has the right to decide. Wouldn't that be a very easy
that's
explanation?
correct. It's about the location of authority, and then in areas beyond national jurisdiction, you need to have a joint framework in order to set the rules. And otherwise, and this is really going into the background. The Law of the Sea Convention establishes that, prior to this treaty entering into force, there is no legal authority. For example, they may adopt a protected area, or there is very few rules regarding environmental assessment, especially very few with details attached to them, and there is also no specific regulation of marine genetic resources. This is the three topics covered by the treaty, and the point of this treaty was to cover precisely these gaps.
And since it covers 2/3 of all the oceans, it was not seen as a problem, the environmental state of that, because it was so big that it could easily erase everything. But now, with a growing population and with much more utilization of the sea, you can even in these big areas, you can see environmental impact of humans, and you can see that the ecosystems are affected, and that's why. This treaty fills an important legal gap to cover such a big area that was not really covered by any kind of environmental regulation before.
Yeah.
And another way of explaining the role of this treaty is that you have certain international regimes that also affect the high seas, for instance, for shipping, but in this case, maybe more important also for fisheries. You have regional fishery bodies of different kinds. And you have also an evolving regime under the International Seabed Authorities for deep seabed mining. So these are sectoral approaches trying to somehow solve the problems also related to the environment. But this is more, what shall I say, a starting point here for the treaty is more the environment, at least the two first parts of the treaty. There are other issues related to equity and sharing of marine genetic resources.
Yeah, that's actually a key issue. The fact that the treaty tries to address environmental issues from a cross-sector perspective, as opposed to what we have today, which Gunnar explained, which is sectoral regulation, which means coordination is difficult, harmonization is difficult, and everything is dealt with in isolation.
And why is it difficult? I mean, maybe that leads to the next question. Like the global focus in this area is quite geopolitical. I mean, there's a lot of interests in the deep sea because of the fishes, because of the rare earth minerals. How do you as scientists navigate in all this? Like in terms of all this, there's all this political loaded interest in the area. Also, just how do you analyze it?
No, I think we are kind of social scientists, so we are not expert in the biological and ecological things in the ocean. But as I said, there is this growing interest about the marine environment because it's deteriorating, and it's not just a question of saving endangered species. It's about the blue economy. It's about all the resources that are provided from the sea, and so there is a need to have some kind of international regulation of that, and that is what this treaty is trying to do, and that is our interest in trying to see how could these policies and how could these legal frameworks work to protect the oceans, and thereby also all the ecosystem services that are provided with the depleting fish stocks, with the pollution, and with the and the other threats.
If I may add something, I just want to add a little edge to what Christian said, because just to recall a slogan, the critical legal study movement in the United States a few decades ago, and they would focus on the critical approaches to legal analysis, and their slogan was all law is politics, which was obviously an hyperbole, but it was to indicate that the law is always like an archive of conflict, and if you look at the negotiation of this treaty, you will find that there's been conflicts every step of the way in relation to different topics, but especially on the aspect of resources corruption, which is the topic of marine genetic resources and the sharing of benefits. And so there's definitely that dimension has been always part of the discussions. Maybe less so in relation to the environmental aspect. There's been, negotiations and disagreements, but the real conflict has emerged in relation to marine genetic resources. And then the conflict was primarily aligned in relation to North-South relations, in ways that reflected the same type of conflicts during the negotiation of the Law Sea Convention in relation to mineral extraction, deep seabed mining. So that is inevitably part of it. And whether it's geopolitics or simply politics, that's a different question. I think if we move closer to the Arctic today, we definitely see that geopolitics has become a crucial dimension in every governance questions. But there's politics all the way when it comes to international negotiations, because states will have different interest in access to resources and how distribution occurs through the rules.
I mean, the treaty addresses 4 issues, and it was said that 2 of those issues were the developing nations, and 2 of these issues were the developed nations' agendas. And as Vito said, I mean, it was about equity and sharing the benefits from the oceans, and how to support and aid poorer nations to fulfill their obligations. And you have followed the negotiations more closely than me, but I mean, from what I could read, this was crucial, that you couldn't reach an agreement on the environmental issues unless you also solved the equity issues.
That's true, yes, and that was that's very much a mirror of the global political situation when negotiating this biodiversity convention, the global one, which is dealing with biodiversity within national jurisdiction on land and in waters that are not beyond, where there was this division between developed and developing countries, and where developing countries said we don't want to protect our nature unless we get a share of the benefits in what is derived from that, genetic resources for pharmaceutical, for agriculture, and things like that, things you could find in the developing countries. And there a regime was made for fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. So you made the countries, they kind of owned the genetic resources, and you needed to have a permit and negotiations of benefit sharing with them. And they wanted a similar, a parallel instrument in the BBNJ. Of course, there was the big difference. There was no countries to negotiate. There were not 2 countries. It was beyond national jurisdiction. So it must be something of a multilateral character, and they fought very hard for having an instrument on genetic resources, marine genetic resources, that was very similar to the one for minerals on the deep seabed, where there is an obligatory benefit sharing regime. And it goes too far to explain the rules very clearly. It didn't came out that way, actually, but it somehow is a bit similar to the system for deep seabed mining. There is a mechanism now when you researchers and prospectors use the genetic resources, and there are a lot very big potentials in them. There needs to be a mechanism where you can share the benefits, and that those benefits may also go for capacity building in developing countries, but also maybe for different issues, efforts that are needed to promote the protection of the oceans in a way. But all that remains to be developed. It's everything we talk about now is, and how the treaty will work. We don't know much about that because it's speculations. It will all have to be unfold when the treaty enters into force, and there are these conference of the parties meeting that would establish closer rules.
So is there a deadline? Just to, for the listeners?
There's no deadline as such, but there is like a set of rules that will establish when the treaty will enter into force, and that is when 60 states will have ratified the treaty.
Okay.
And then there is 120 days latency after the 60th ratification, which means that states will have to sign the treaty, so to show the intention to become a party. And so far, already 85 states have done that.
Exactly.
But then they also need to go back home, and according each to their democratic process or political process, they had to ratify the treaty, so confirm this intention to become a state parties, and that can take quite a lot of time because each procedure is it's peculiar, and it may take a good amount of years before we reach that threshold.
This illustrates very, very well the slow evolution of international negotiations. I mean, it's more than 20 years since these issues were raised on the agenda. It took a long time before it was formalized into negotiations, and we had an agreement. And now Vito explains that we must wait, let's say, 4 or 5 years before the treaty enters into force. And then comes the question, how well will it function? And how can you improve the treaty? Because a lot of issues, well, here we can have a conversation about whether the glass is half full or half empty. But there are, if you want to make improvements on those issues that were not solved during the negotiation process this time, you will need to rely on the meeting of the parties and how they will develop the treaty. And that may take
another 20 years.
A long time.
We've seen with the climate regime how long it may take to make little progress. And we will have a similar mechanism here, maybe not as problematic, as controversial, but certainly will take time to develop. First, the rules that need to be applied in order for these bodies to work.
Exactly. No,
sorry.
No, and for example, now when we see like Norwegians claiming land within the high seas, does that also process wait until the high seas treaty is completed, or how is the process?
That's a different process. So what is happening now, especially in the Arctic, is that there is a process under Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Convention for states to declare so-called extended continental shelf. So may not need to go into the details. So, but that's a process that's been ongoing now, and there is it's not like a claim as such, but it's a recognition of something that's already there. That are the rules, and then the only thing that states need to do is to present their case in terms of the extension of this area for which they claim jurisdiction that is authority to regulate, and to a body constituted under the Law of the Sea Convention, which is the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which then will present recommendation which finalize the borders of these areas. And now all the Arctic states have done that, the last one being the United States, which, however, is not part of the convention on the law of the sea, so has made a declaration independently from the submission to this commission. But that's all within the rules, and it's totally unrelated to the law, to the High Seas Treaty, except for the fact that once these limits are final, then those areas that have been determined to be under the jurisdiction of the different articles of states will not be subject to the competence of the BBNJ treaty, but will be within the jurisdiction of each individual state.
But you phrase some of your questions into geopolitical tensions, and to add a comment to what Vito just explained, this is an orderly process following the procedures under the Law of the Sea Convention. It's not drama at all. So, but there are recommendations from this UN body, And then it's up to the states to negotiate.
Mm. And
So-
that's where the drama can evolve.
Norway and
Russia.
Russia negotiated some 30 years or 35 years, I think it was, before we came into an agreement. That may be the perspective also for these negotiations between the Arctic states having overlapping claims.
Mm-hmm.
So normally there wouldn't be any drama. Then
No.
there was long process to arrive at the limitation.
Mm-hmm.
But in the change in geopolitical conditions, things may change and may not be so smooth.
Unless someone take initiatives on what others say that they have a right, that can of course create conflict.
But the key is that there is this process regulated and accepted, and it's orderly, however slow it may be. So there's a lot of hype on this on the news, claiming Arctic territory or the North Pole under the sea, but it's really not so problematic as it may appear from media representation of it.
That's interesting because that's really the impression you have as a person that's interested in the Arctic and also like concerning mining and the environment and all this. But do you trust that the policy makers that make these laws are incapable of doing it and doing it in the right time frame and in the right conditions?
So that's a different question. So you had this process under the the Sea Convention. That's one thing. Now, what one does after this process is over in relation to the exploitation of resources, that's an entirely different thing. It may not be so orderly. It may not be so sustainable. And deep sea bed mining is a big issue, and it's a problematic issue, and there is a lot of conflicts in relation to whether or not one should do it from an environmental point of view, how crucial it is for the green shift. So there's not so much hype there. It is a real problem, but it's not connected to the claims.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe we can talk a bit about language, because actually in your presentation yesterday, you talk a bit of like use of terms and use of language, both within the contract, but also within the Laws Convention, for example, like the word, for example, significant, like these certain big terms that maybe don't have like a value, or like we don't know what it means to be significant. Could you maybe briefly explain to our listeners?
I talked about it in relation to environmental impact assessments. And the basic assumption is that if you do some kind of intervention into an ecosystem, you want to develop something, you want to fish, whatever it is, you do harm to the ecosystem somehow. But if that harm is very, very small, you accept it. And there is a threshold which is called significance. So if it's below significant, you will normally accept that harm. If it's above, you will usually not accept it, or you will require some kind of mitigation. That is the basic reasoning behind it. Then to define what is significance,
exactly,
that is really tricky.
And has there been a conversation making the treaty? What is the threshold?
It has been. They have tried to operationalize it in the treaty in an annex. So there are indications and examples of, for instance, the magnitude of the operation, the vulnerability of the receiving environment. To take two issues that are on the top of my head.
But the key is that at the end of the day, the determination of whether the threshold has been exceeded has to be done on a case-by-case basis. So it's impossible to determine it beforehand.
There would be a lot of work to do by the bodies under the treaty to spell out this more. Even if it is already in an annex, that would be the job of that would be one of the tasks of the scientific body that will be there, and later so there is a lot to be filled out that is not does not appear clearly in the negotiation text, and that is these procedures and thresholds for environmental impact assessment will clearly be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
This, when it comes to environmental impact assessment, this affects it in two stages. One thing is whether it's required to do an assessment or not. Then, if there is a likelihood that there will be significant impacts, then you will normally be required to undertake an EIA. And there are different approaches for doing that. For instance, listing of activities that always will require. That's one approach. But the next question is, when you have done the impact assessment, you have found out that there will be certain impacts that are significant, then the question comes to the decision making. And one has to remember that impact assessments is a procedure. So the regulations, they will be in other pieces of law. So the interconnection here and what will be accepted and what will be required of mitigation, that will be crucial in the decision making afterwards.
So I don't have the data before me, but generally, if there is an impact assessment that is carried out, then the activity gets a green light. There may be some request for modification in terms of some of the impacts, but usually part of this process, and then it's checked, it's done, and then the activity moves forward. So that's a bit, it is crucial to do that, but there is this dimension that being a procedural step, it doesn't give any substantive indication.
And it will be up to each country that undertake the activities to carry on the EIA, and they may be in a different state of development or ability to do that. At one stage, there was it was on the table whether there should be a global EIA mechanism, so it will be above the countries, the impact assessment, but that was not accepted in the end. But that at one stage that was also on the table.
What actors did not want to accept that?
Well, I don't really remember. It's just that it was there was no consensus for that. That would probably be developed countries, actors that were not in favor of that.
Yeah, it was roughly that north-south alignment again. The developing countries wanted to have this global body for a number of reasons, including the fact that many of them maybe don't have the capacity to carry out assessments across any range of activities, and they wanted to have this global body to fulfill the function. But that was one of several reasons, but didn't fly.
No.
The bodies of the treaty will have some measure of authority in relation to this broader assessment, which doesn't focus on individual projects or activities, but it may focus on broader projects and policy, and maybe also of a regional scope, which Gunnar is particularly fond of, which is strategic environmental assessment. But there is only a very short provision about that the Conference of the Party may carry out one such assessment. And so there's no really beef on the bone. We'll need to see. It's one of those issues that will have to be developed by the conference, by the treaty bodies, if and when they are set up and start operating.
Yeah, could you maybe briefly explain the strategic environmental assessment?
It's a very broad concept, because what you are supposed to assess is not a very concrete development, tangible, something that is to be done, a project or somehow, but it's an initiative of a higher level, more abstract, that subsequently will lead to concrete developments. So usually policy plans and program is a kind of shorthand for this. And it's an umbrella for there are so many different approaches for doing this type of assessment. So it's different from the more project-oriented assessment, for which there has been, a blueprint since at least the mid-1980s. And one of the big achievements of this treaty now is that this blueprint has now been written into an international text for the law of the sea. Hopefully it will influence a lot of other jurisdictions as well. Other regimes, other national states' laws when it comes to impact assessments. but the strategic environmental assessment was not covered very, very well. And that is part of my criticism here, because this is crucial, both the strategic environmental assessment, where you assess the state of the environment for a whole region. Mm-hmm. There is a provision that opens up for it, and the conference of the parties may develop rules for it later, meaning that this is something that, well, I don't know, but I assume that it will take years before you may have provisions for that. Let's say 10, 15, who knows, years. And in the meantime, you will need to for instance, assess more strategic interests in opening up regions for deep seabed mining. Well, that's one sectoral initiative. But if you want to assess that in a broader ecosystem perspective, you need this regional approach. And whether you want to, and you need to understand the state of the environment before you can do good project-oriented assessments, before you can come to the allocation of or to set aside areas for marine protected areas. You need to have to understand the environment. So this is so crucial. This lack of mechanism for understanding the environment and also for the scientific collaboration needed to get the knowledge.
And let's say if sorry.
No, I was going to say that it's not only this type of mechanism that could take a very long time to be carried out. It would be any kind of things in the treaty, because it's not in force. It will take some years before it comes. It will depend on the ratifications, whether it will enter into force at any stage. So, but and we are talking about all these formal requirements, but there are also informal external factors that could influence that, and that could be that that there remains a kind of attention and momentum and will and talk about this treaty, that it's important and that it needs to enter into force. So that could create an atmosphere where things may speed up a little, and the countries will that are in doubt about whether they would ratify would do it if there is come a kind of a political pressure and attention to that. So that I see as very important for both if the treaty will work and when it will start working.
May I add one thing in relation to strategic environmental assessment in order to bring it a bit closer to the Arctic? And that is, this is something I've argued in my work for a while now, that it would have been very useful if the treaty had established at the outset some mechanisms for incorporating. A lot of work has been done in other contexts. And since that hasn't been done, it would be useful if this could be played into the development of the competence of, in particular, the subsidiary body on science. That will be set up if the treaty gets into force. And in the Arctic, there's been a lot of work done by the Arctic Council and its working groups, in particular PAIM, in relation to the organization of the regions of the Arctic in large marine ecosystems. And that will provide precisely the type of geographical and ecosystem scope upon which strategic environmental assessment could be developed. And then, that process would take place. So one hope in a way is that this, and then there's many others. There's this Convention on Biological Diversity that's developed in relation to protected areas, a map of EBSAs, ecological and biological sensitive areas, but it doesn't have the authority to establish protected areas there. And then the treaty, WinGA treaty, will be in a position to utilize that map in order to. So this will be development that will be greatly useful for really coming down to the effective implementation of the treaty. But it will take a lot of work. The time before ratification gives us maybe some time, not us three, but us researchers in general, commentators, the public, NGOs, time to really develop scenarios that may be useful for the negotiation. But then once it comes down to it, there is this interface between law and politics that it always makes things a bit more complicated.
And maybe
You're not convinced.
I'm convinced.
But I'm just curious, who is monitoring? Let's say that the treaty is agreed, and then countries start mining or fishing in these areas that they have normally not been doing. Who is monitoring these activities, and who is then held accountable, and who is benefiting?
Well, there is this technical and scientific body established under, and that will have a very big importance. It will probably not have unlimited resources to carry out all kind of monitoring things. So they would be dependent on other bodies that are monitoring the marine environment. And there, the Arctic Council is very important for this part of the world, of course, and because they are really, you can say a lot about the Arctic Council, but they have produced a lot of very important scientific work and monitoring and assessment work that could also be relevant for that. Otherwise, there would also be very big gaps in knowledge still. And that's a problem especially for the marine environment. There's a lot of gaps and problems, but especially in the marine environment, there is a lot of gaps. But so that this treaty will not be able to fill out by itself. There would be it will need to be put pressure on that from many other sources in order to get, and you probably will never get the full picture, but there is still a lot of room for improvement here for scientific work.
But just to add on the Arctic Council and the assessment, because this is probably extraordinary. I'm not aware of any other region in the world where you have such a machinery for setting up scientific assessments. So I agree very much with what they have said. The others here have said about that. And when it comes to my disappointment about the lack of obligations for scientific collaboration here, the Arctic Council and the Arctic states collaborating through the Arctic Council can be a very good example. I mean, they can organize. They already have demonstrated that they can organize scientific collaboration, storage of data in databases, and so forth, that makes such collaboration possible.
Which currently now is paused because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I'm not that much into the details of how it operates, but I mean, this has been ongoing in the Arctic Council since the establishment at the end of the 1990s. So there is a huge knowledge, huge knowledge deposited, for instance, in databases already, which you don't take away by the political problems that are now. But I use this as an example of where the Arctic states can both be a good example for the rest of the world, and where they can put things into movement for the Arctic regions.
Yeah, no, I wanted to add really something a bit lateral to this, because I wanted to clarify that the BBNJ Treaty has competence in relation to very specific topics: marine protected areas, environmental impact assessment, then marine genetic resources, and then internal mechanism, which is capacity building and transfer technology. But all the activities that you mentioned in some occasions, fishing, deep sea bed mining, shipping, they will remain under the competence of the sectoral bodies: International Maritime Organization, International Seabed Authority, regional fisheries management organizations. And so it will be important, and this was the topic of presentation yesterday by Christian, to see how this new treaty will interact with the existing bodies. And there's a large number of those bodies across the world, but also in relation to the Arctic. And the key discussion that's been going on in the negotiations is that this new BBNJ treaty, or the High Seas Treaty, should not undermine these other instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And so there will be, and there are some rules established in the treaty. We would have they have another couple of days just to go through them.
We only have a minute left.
But that's so how this relationship is understood and articulated, whether in a cooperative manner or in an antagonist manner, will be crucial also for the functioning of the treaty.
Yeah, and there I think change. I think the development has changed to the better a little, because this undermining phrase was invented was underlining a potential conflict with those sectoral regimes, especially the fisheries agreement, and probably there would still be some tensions, but I think there is a growing awareness that this High Seas Treaty and Fisheries Agreement, they may not just have conflicting interests. They have actually mutually supportive interest in protecting the marine ecosystems, because that's where the fish come from. That's what we finally all depend on. And fishery is the biggest threat right now to the health of the marine ecosystems. And so there should really be a mutual interest here between these two kind of bodies. But all that remains to be seen. And the success of this treaty will depend fully on how it cooperates with these other bodies that Vito was mentioning. It's the key to the success.
But underlying this is an issue that maybe not all the listeners are thinking about. We simply don't have a world sovereign. We don't have a world government. As opposed to if you're in one nation, there is one government that may decide. In the international order, it's not. The international order is built up of independent states and what they build up of different agreements. So what Christian and Vito just have described is the result of such an international regime.
So how would you envision, just on the last note, how this treaty will evolve in the near future? Can we see this, that there will be an agreement at some point, and what is the deadline for it? When will it happen?
Well, the agreement is set there now, so the crucial issue is to get the ratification, the 60 ratification that Vito explained.
And if you should give a year?
5 years. Maybe in 5 years.
Okay. We will schedule our next talk then.
But I think it's crucial what Christian says. I hope Christian is right about the positive momentum from the last negotiations.
Yeah, I think, it's just because I felt very lonely following this process for 20 years, because it seemed like nobody else was very interested in it. But then suddenly within the last year, when the treaty was agreed, there was suddenly a big awareness about it, and for good reasons, I think. And it was seen as a tool also to live up to the global biodiversity commitments that were made on the global biodiversity framework, with 30% of the world protected and things like that. So that for me was a positive thing, and that is also in relation to get awareness from these other bodies and frameworks that it needs to collaborate with. So in the best of world, there would be a kind of synergy and mutually supportiveness between this treaty that is somehow the overall treaty dealing with the ecosystem as such, and then these other sector treaties that have specific knowledge to put into this treaty, but also the other way around, that the treaty would inform them about the state of the ecosystem and why solutions for protection are needed, that it's not just sectoral in isolation, but holistic and ecosystem based. That's the best of the world. That's how it should work. We can just speculate about how it is, but I think, as I said yesterday, the fact that we are talking about it now and something is being recorded for others to listen to, that's part of the process to keep the momentum going.
Great.
Yeah, that's a great ending note. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And thank you, listeners, listening from the live broadcast. You can then later on follow the episodes on radioarctic.net. And you can also follow our next session tomorrow. Energy security is geopolitics at 12:15. Thank you so much. And yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.